Welcome back to Wild West Stories, where the dust never settles and every story reveals the raw, untamed spirit of the American frontier. I'm your host, and today we're riding into one of the most powerful tales of redemption I've ever encountered. So grab your hat, settle into your saddle, and prepare for a story that will challenge everything you think you know about good and evil, love and loss, and the incredible power of second chances. Today's tale takes us to the scorching desert town of Redemption Creek, where the morning sun casts long shadows and secrets run deeper than the nearby canyons. It's a story about Sister Margaret, a gentle nun who teaches orphaned children their letters and prayers. But Sister Margaret harbors a dark secret. She wasn't always a woman of God. Once upon a time, in the smoky saloons of Tombstone, she was known by a very different name, Red Rose Mary. When the most feared outlaw in 3 territories rides into her quiet town, with vengeance in his heart and a rope in his hands, the past and present collide in the most dramatic way imaginable. This is the story of what happens when a nun's protective love meets an outlaw's thirst for blood, when 3 simple words spoken by a dying mother 20 years ago echo across time to change 2 broken souls forever. If you're drawn to stories of redemption that dig deep into the human heart, tales of unexpected courage that bloom in the darkest moments, and the transformative power of love that can reach even the most hardened spirits, then you're in for something special. This is a tale that will stay with you long after the last word is spoken, a reminder that it's never too late to choose who you want to become. The rope was already around Sister Margaret's neck when Blackjack Morrison asked his final question. "Any last words before you meet your maker?" The nun looked him straight in the eye, her voice steady despite the noose. "I've already met him," she said, "and he told me your real name." "Jackie." The outlaw's hand froze on the rope. How could she know the name only his dead mother had called him? But to understand how we arrived at this moment of life and death, we must go back 6 hours earlier to when the sun rose over Redemption Creek like a blessing, casting golden light through the windows of the small schoolhouse where Sister Margaret taught 12 orphan children. At 45, Sister Margaret had found something she never thought possible in her youth: peace. Her hands, once soft from powders and perfumes, now bore the honest calluses of hard work and genuine service. The red silk dresses and painted lips were memories from another lifetime, replaced by the simple brown habit of her order and the quiet satisfaction of nurturing young minds. "Today we're learning about forgiveness," she told the children, her voice gentle but firm. The morning lesson had been about redemption, how people could change, how God's love could transform even the most broken souls. How prophetic those words would prove to be. Little Timothy, only 7 years old with hair the color of wheat and eyes like summer sky, raised his small hand. "Sister Margaret, what if someone is really, really bad? Like, what if they hurt people? Can God still forgive them?" Sister Margaret knelt beside his wooden desk, her brown habit rustling softly against the rough-hewn floor. The question struck her more deeply than the child could know. Every morning she wrestled with this very question when she looked at herself in the mirror. "Timothy," she said, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder, "God's love is like the sun. It shines on everyone, even those who think they don't deserve it, even those who have done terrible things. The question isn't whether God can forgive. It's whether we can forgive ourselves and truly change." 9-year-old Sarah, with her dark braids and serious eyes, spoke up from the second row. "But sister, what if the bad person doesn't want to change? What if they like being bad?" Sister Margaret paused, looking at the innocent faces surrounding her. How could she explain to these children that evil was often born from pain? That sometimes people hurt others because they themselves had been hurt so deeply that cruelty became their only defense against a world that had shown them no mercy? Sometimes, and Sarah, people who seem evil are really just scared and hurt. They build walls around their hearts to protect themselves, but those walls also keep out love and kindness. Our job is to show them that it's safe to let those walls down. She didn't know that within the hour she would be putting that philosophy to the ultimate test. The first gunshot shattered the morning silence like a hammer through stained glass. Sister Margaret's head snapped toward the window, her blood turning to ice in her veins. Through the dusty glass she saw them, 7 men on horseback, their faces hard as the desert stone. their guns already drawn and gleaming in the morning sun. Blackjack Morrison sat tall in his saddle at their head, his black hat casting a shadow over eyes that had witnessed too much death and dealt out even more. She recognized him immediately, though she hadn't seen him in nearly 8 years. Time had hardened him further, carving deeper lines around his eyes and mouth. But there was no mistaking that predatory grace, that aura of barely contained violence that had once thrilled and terrified her in equal measure. "Children, quickly!" Sister Margaret whispered urgently, fighting to keep the panic from her voice. "Under the desks now. Stay quiet and don't move no matter what happens." But it was already too late. The schoolhouse door exploded inward with a crash that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. Splinters of wood flew across the room like angry hornets, and several of the children screamed despite their teacher's instructions. Blackjack Morrison strode through the destroyed doorway, his boots heavy on the wooden floor, his presence filling the small space with an almost tangible sense of menace. Behind him came his gang, men whose names were whispered in fear across 3 territories. There was Scarface Pete, a man who bore a jagged white line from his left ear to the corner of his mouth, a souvenir from a knife fight in El Paso. He had killed his first man at 14 and hadn't stopped counting since. Mad Dog Miller followed, a thin man with wild eyes who was said to laugh while he pulled the trigger, finding genuine joy in others' suffering. Bobby the Kid Reynolds brought up the rear, barely 18, but already wanted for murder in Colorado, New Mexico, and Arizona. His baby face and easy smile made him all the more dangerous, because people trusted him right up until the moment he shot them. "Well, well," Blackjack drawled, his voice like gravel mixed with honey, smooth but rough around the edges. "What do we have here? A bunch of little rats hiding in their hole?" His eyes swept the room, taking in the crude wooden desks, the slate board where Sister Margaret had been writing the day's Bible verse, the small bookshelf containing the few precious volumes the town had managed to acquire for their children's education. This was clearly a place of learning and innocence, exactly the kind of place Blackjack Morrison took pleasure in corrupting. Sister Margaret stepped forward without hesitation, placing herself between the outlaws and the children. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a caged bird, but her voice remained steady. "This is a house of God and learning. You have no business here." Blackjack's eyes narrowed as he studied her face, and she saw the exact moment recognition dawned. Something flickered in his expression. Surprise, perhaps, or dark amusement. A slow smile spread across his weathered features, but it held no warmth. "Sister Margaret, is it?" He tilted his head like a wolf examining wounded prey. "You know, you look mighty familiar, sister." "Real familiar. Like I've seen that pretty face somewhere before." Sister Margaret's mouth went dry, but she forced herself to meet his gaze without flinching. "I've never seen you before in my life." "Now that's funny," Blackjack said slowly, walking closer with the measured steps of a predator who knew his prey had nowhere to run. "Because I could swear I knew you when you went by a different name, when you wore red silk instead of brown wool, when you danced on tables and men paid good money just to watch you move." The children under the desk whimpered softly, sensing the danger even if they didn't understand the words. Sister Margaret felt their fear like a physical weight on her shoulders. "That life is dead," she cut him off sharply, her voice carrying a finality that brooked no argument. "Whatever you think you know about me died 5 years ago." Blackjack threw back his head and laughed, a sound completely devoid of humor. "Dead? Oh, Red Rose Mary, nothing ever really dies. It just gets buried deeper, waiting for the right moment to claw its way back to the surface." The name hit the children like a physical blow. Red Rose Mary. Some of the older residents of Redemption Creek remembered that name, whispered in saloons and spoken with a mixture of admiration and shame. The most beautiful soiled dove in 3 territories, they said. A woman who could drink any cowboy under the table, dance until dawn, and pick a man's pocket while she kissed him goodnight. But that woman had vanished 5 years ago, replaced by the gentle, patient teacher who had dedicated her life to caring for orphan children. The transformation had been so complete that most people had convinced themselves the resemblance was mere coincidence. Little Sarah began to cry softly under her desk, the sound piercing through the tension like a knife blade. The noise seemed to focus Blackjack's attention on the children for the first time. "What do you want?" Sister Margaret demanded, drawing his attention back to herself. "Information," Blackjack replied, his voice taking on a businesslike tone that was somehow more frightening than his earlier mockery. "About the gold shipment that came through here 3 days ago. About where Sheriff Williams might be hiding it. About how many men he's got watching the bank." Sister Margaret's mind raced. She did know about the gold, a federal shipment bound for the territorial capital, carrying enough money to fund a small army. Sheriff Williams had indeed hidden it somewhere in town, and she was one of the few people who knew its location. But giving that information to Blackjack Morrison would mean signing the death warrants of every man in Redemption Creek who might try to defend it. "I know nothing about any gold," she lied smoothly. Blackjack's eyes glittered with dangerous amusement. "See, I think you're lying to me, sister, and I really, truly don't like being lied to." He pulled out his gun, a beautiful Colt 45 with a pearl handle, the metal polished to a mirror shine. Sister Margaret had seen that gun before, in another life, in another world. She remembered the weight of it in her own hands when Blackjack had taught her to shoot behind the saloon in Tombstone. She remembered the way he'd stood behind her, his arms around her, guiding her aim. "You know what happens to people who lie to me, don't you, Mary?" Blackjack said softly, using her old name like a caress and a threat combined. Before she could answer, he gestured to Mad Dog Miller. "Check the back room for anything valuable. Pete, you search the desk for papers. Kid, watch the windows." The men moved to obey, their boots echoing loudly in the small space. Mad Dog Miller headed toward the supply closet where Sister Margaret kept extra books and teaching materials. Pete began rifling through her desk with rough hands, scattering papers and breaking the careful order she maintained. That's when little Timothy made his fatal mistake. Frightened beyond rational thought and desperate to reach his older sister who lived across the street, the 7-year-old boy bolted from under his desk and ran toward the door. His small legs pumped frantically as he tried to escape the nightmare that had invaded his safe haven. Mad Dog Miller saw the movement from the corner of his eye and reacted with the instant, mindless violence that had earned him his nickname. Without hesitation, he swung his rifle toward the fleeing child, his finger already tightening on the trigger. "No!" Sister Margaret screamed, her voice raw with terror and protective fury. Time seemed to slow to a crawl, each second stretching into an eternity. She saw Miller's finger tighten on the trigger. She saw Timothy's wide, terrified eyes as he realized death was reaching for him. She saw the other children watching in horror from under their desks, their innocent faces twisted with fear. In that crystallized moment, Sister Margaret made a choice that would echo through the remainder of her life. Her hand found the letter opener on her desk, 8 inches of sharp steel that she used for opening correspondence from the territorial government. Her body moved without conscious thought, driven by 5 years of caring for these children, of loving them as fiercely as if they were her own flesh and blood. The blade slid between Mad Dog Miller's ribs with surprising ease, finding the space between bone and slipping into his heart like it was meant to be there. He looked down in shock and confusion, watching his own blood bloom across his shirt like a crimson flower. Then he looked up at Sister Margaret's face, seeing something there that made his eyes go wide with fear before they went dark forever. Mad Dog Miller collapsed to the wooden floor with a wet, choking sound that would haunt Sister Margaret's dreams for years to come. The schoolhouse fell completely silent except for the children's terrified breathing and the sound of blood dripping slowly from the letter opener onto the floor. Blackjack stared at his dead companion, then at Sister Margaret, then at the bloody weapon in her hand. The other outlaws had frozen in place, uncertain how to react to the sudden turn of events. None of them had expected a nun to kill one of their own. Slowly, like the sun rising over a battlefield, Blackjack began to smile. It wasn't the expression of humor, but something much darker and more dangerous. "Well, I'll be damned," he said softly, his voice filled with a mixture of admiration and deadly intent. "Red Rose Mary just killed one of my men." 20 minutes later, Sister Margaret found herself standing in the town square of Redemption Creek with a rope around her neck. Her hands bound tightly behind her back with coarse hemp that bit into her wrists. News of Mad Dog Miller's death had spread through the small community like wildfire, and now nearly half the town had gathered to witness what Blackjack Morrison called frontier justice. The mayor, a soft, well-meaning man named Cornelius Whitman, wrung his hands nervously as he tried to reason with the outlaw leader. Sweat beaded on his pale forehead despite the morning chill, and his voice quavered with barely controlled fear. "Now see here, Morrison," he pleaded, his words tumbling over each other in his haste. "This woman is a nun, a woman of God. She's done nothing but good for this town since she arrived. She runs our school, cares for our orphan children, tends to our sick." "She murdered my man," Blackjack replied with deadly calm, his fingers testing the hangman's knot with professional expertise. "In cold blood, right in front of a bunch of children too. Drove a blade right into his heart without so much as a, 'How do you do?' That doesn't strike me as very Christian behavior." "She was protecting a child," shouted Mrs. Henderson, the baker's wife, her usually gentle voice raised in righteous indignation. "Your man was about to shoot little Timothy, a 7-year-old boy. What kind of monster aims a gun at a child?" Blackjack's cold eyes swept over the crowd, and his gaze was like winter wind across a grave. The assembled townspeople fell silent under that terrible stare, their protests dying in their throats. These were simple people, farmers, shopkeepers, craftsmen, who had never faced anything more dangerous than a rattlesnake or a flash flood. They were not equipped to deal with a man like Blackjack Morrison, who had built his reputation on violence and intimidation. "The way I see it," Blackjack continued in that same conversational tone that made his words all the more chilling, "that's her word against a dead man's. And dead men, as we all know, don't get to tell their side of the story." He walked slowly around Sister Margaret like a wolf circling wounded prey, his boots clicking against the hard-packed earth of the town square. Despite the rope around her neck and the very real possibility of death looming over her, Sister Margaret's spine remained straight, her chin raised in defiance. The morning sun caught the silver threads in her brown hair that had escaped from her simple white coif, and there was something almost ethereal about her courage in the face of certain doom. "You know what I think, sister," Blackjack said, his voice carrying easily across the silent square. "I think you've been playing a part all these years, pretending to be something you're not. I think underneath all that holy talk and those pious prayers, you're still the same Red Rose Mary who used to dance on tables in Tombstone for whiskey money." The crowd stirred uneasily at this revelation. Some of the older residents had harbored suspicions about their school teacher's past, but most had chosen not to ask uncomfortable questions. Sister Margaret had been nothing but kind and good to their children, and her past had seemed irrelevant in the face of her present dedication. "Still the same woman," Blackjack continued relentlessly, "who could drink any cowboy under the table and pick his pocket while she kissed him goodnight. Still the same Mary who shared my bed for the better part of 2 years and knew every scar on my body." Several women in the crowd gasped at this crude revelation, their hands flying to their mouths in shock. Children were quickly ushered away by embarrassed parents who didn't want them to hear such talk. But Blackjack wasn't finished. "I think," he said, stopping directly in front of Sister Margaret and looking into her eyes, "that when push came to shove, when the chips were down and the cards were on the table, you reverted to type. Violence, blood, death. That's what you really are, underneath all that Christian charity and self-sacrifice." Sister Margaret met his gaze without flinching, her voice clear and strong when she finally spoke. "You're right about one thing, Morrison. I was Red Rose Mary. I danced for men's money and laughed at their crude jokes. I drank their whiskey and pretended to care about their problems because it meant survival. I lived in sin and thought I was beyond redemption." She paused, letting her words sink in, her eyes never leaving his face. "But you're wrong about everything else. I didn't kill your man because I reverted to anything. I killed him because I love those children more than I fear death. More than I fear you. And given the choice, I would do it again without hesitation." The rope creaked ominously in the morning breeze that was beginning to pick up, carrying with it the scent of sage and distant rain. Blackjack's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and for a moment something flickered in his eyes. Pain, perhaps, or the ghost of an old wound that had never properly healed. Love, he spat, his voice heavy with contempt, and something that might have been envy. You talk about love like you know what it means, like you understood it when you walked away from me without so much as a goodbye, like you cared about anything other than your own selfish desires when you disappeared in the middle of the night, taking my heart with you. The raw emotion in his voice surprised everyone, including Blackjack himself. For just a moment, the mask of cold professionalism slipped, revealing the wounded man underneath. But the vulnerability lasted only seconds before the shutters came down again, his expression hardening back into its familiar lines of cruelty and indifference. That was a long time ago, Sister Margaret said softly, and for the first time since the rope had been placed around her neck, her voice carried a note of sadness. I was a different person then. We both were. No, Blackjack said, his hand moving to the rope's end with deliberate slowness. I'm exactly the same man I always was. You're the one who changed, and not for the better. At least when you were a whore, you were honest about what you were. The cruel word hit her like a physical blow, but Sister Margaret didn't flinch. She had heard worse, endured worse, and survived it all. If that's what you need to believe to justify this, then so be it. But know this, Jackie. Don't, Blackjack snarled, his composure cracking again at the sound of that name. Don't you dare call me that. You can hang me, Sister Margaret continued as if he hadn't spoken, but it won't change the fact that those children are safe. It won't bring back the man you've become because of the pain you've carried all these years. And it won't heal the hurt that's been eating at your soul since the day your mother died. Blackjack went very still, his hand frozen on the rope. Around them, the crowd seemed to hold its collective breath, sensing that they were witnessing something profound and dangerous. How do you know about my mother? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sister Margaret's eyes softened with compassion and old sorrow. Because you told me, Jackie. Late one night when you'd had too much to drink and the nightmares wouldn't let you sleep. You told me about finding her body when you were 6 years old, about how the fever took her and how she whispered something to you just before she died. Blackjack's face had gone pale beneath his tan, and his breathing became shallow and rapid. The crowd watched in fascination and growing confusion as the fearsome outlaw seemed to shrink before their eyes, becoming something smaller and more vulnerable. You told me, Sister Margaret continued gently, that her last words were, "You're still loved, Jackie. No matter what happens, remember that you're still loved." The effect of those words was immediate and devastating. Blackjack stumbled backward as if he'd been shot, his hand falling away from the rope entirely. His eyes went wide with shock and something that might have been terror. No, he breathed. No, that's impossible. I never told anyone that. Never. You did, Sister Margaret said, her voice filled with infinite tenderness. You cried when you told me. Said it was the last time anyone had ever said they loved you. Said you'd been trying to forget those words ever since because they hurt too much to remember. Blackjack was shaking now, his carefully constructed armor of cruelty and indifference crumbling before the eyes of everyone present. The other outlaws looked on in confusion and growing alarm as their fearless leader seemed to come apart at the seams. But that's not the end of the story, Sister Margaret continued, her voice growing stronger as she saw the impact of her words. Because your mother was right, Jackie. You are still loved. God loves you, even after everything you've done. I loved you once, despite your flaws. And somewhere inside that broken, angry heart of yours, you still love yourself. The little boy who lost his mother, who was hurt and afraid and alone. Tears were streaming down Blackjack's face now, cutting clean tracks through the dust and grime. His gun hung forgotten in his hand as 20 years of carefully buried grief came roaring to the surface like water from a broken dam. She died, he whispered brokenly. She died and left me all alone. Foster families who beat me, streets that nearly killed me, men who used me and threw me away. Where was love then? Where was God when I needed him? Right where he is now, Sister Margaret said firmly, waiting for you to let him in. Waiting for you to believe that you deserve forgiveness, that you can change, that you can be more than the sum of your worst moments. The rope around her neck seemed to grow lighter as she spoke, her fear dissolving in the face of this broken man's pain. This was why she had become a nun, not to hide from her past, but to help others find their way out of the darkness that had once consumed her. "It's not too late, Jackie," she said. "It's never too late to choose love over hatred, forgiveness over revenge, hope over despair. Your mother's words weren't just her last gift to you. They were a prophecy. You are still loved, and you always will be." Blackjack Morrison, the most feared outlaw in 3 territories, sank to his knees in the dust of Redemption Creek's town square and wept like the lost child he had never stopped being. The silence that followed Blackjack's breakdown was profound and sacred, as if the entire town was holding its breath in the presence of something holy. For long moments, the only sounds were the outlaw's ragged sobs and the whisper of wind through the cottonwood trees that lined the square. Sister Margaret stood perfectly still, with the rope still around her neck, her heart breaking for the shattered man kneeling before her. She could see past the hardened killer to the frightened 6-year-old boy who had found his mother's lifeless body and learned too young that the world was a place of pain and abandonment. Scar-faced Pete shifted nervously, his hand moving toward his gun. "Boss?" he called uncertainly. "Boss, what are we doing here? The whole town's watching." Blackjack didn't seem to hear him. His shoulders shook with the force of emotions he had suppressed for decades, grief and rage and longing all pouring out at once. The sight of this feared outlaw reduced to tears was so shocking that several townspeople began to weep themselves, moved by the raw humanity of the moment. But the spell was broken by the sound of galloping horses. Sheriff Tom Williams came thundering into the square at the head of a hastily assembled posse, his rifle already drawn and his face grim with determination. Behind him rode 4 deputies and 6 armed civilians, including the town doctor and the blacksmith. They had heard the gunshots from the schoolhouse and seen the crowd gathering around what appeared to be an execution. "Morrison!" the sheriff shouted, reining in his horse and leveling his weapon at the kneeling outlaw. "Step away from Sister Margaret right now." The moment shattered like glass. Blackjack's head snapped up, his tears still wet on his cheeks, but his eyes already hardening back into their familiar coldness. The vulnerability that had made him seem almost human was disappearing as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by the survival instincts that had kept him alive for so many years. "Tom, no!" Sister Margaret cried out, recognizing the dangerous shift in the atmosphere. "Wait, let me—" But it was too late. Scarface Pete, seeing lawmen with guns pointed at his boss, drew his pistol and fired. The bullet took one of the deputies in the shoulder, spinning him from his saddle with a cry of pain. Instantly, the square erupted into chaos as both sides opened fire. Blackjack rolled behind the wooden platform that had been set up for the hanging, pulling Sister Margaret down with him. Bullets whined overhead and splintered the wood around them as the townspeople scattered in panic, screaming and running for whatever cover they could find. "The kids!" Sister Margaret gasped, trying to struggle to her feet despite her bound hands. "The children are still in the schoolhouse." "Stay down!" Blackjack snarled, his gun now back in his hand as he returned fire at the approaching lawman. The moment of vulnerability was over. He was once again the cold-blooded killer who had terrorized the territory for years. Bobby the Kid Reynolds had taken cover behind a water trough and was laying down suppressing fire with deadly accuracy. 2 more townspeople went down, including Mrs. Henderson, who cried out as a bullet grazed her arm. Scarface Pete was moving from building to building, trying to flank the sheriff's position. "We need to get out of here," Pete called to his boss. "This whole thing's gone to hell." Blackjack's mind was racing, calculating odds and escape routes with the speed born of long experience. But every time he started to move, he found himself looking at Sister Margaret, still bound and helpless beside him. In the heat of battle, he should have been thinking only of survival. But something had changed in those moments when she had spoken his mother's words. A bullet struck the platform inches from his head, showering them both with splinters. Sister Margaret flinched but didn't cry out, her own eyes scanning the chaos for any sign of the children she had tried so hard to protect. "There!" she pointed with her chin toward the schoolhouse. "Timothy's at the window." Blackjack followed her gaze and saw the 7-year-old boy's face pressed against the glass, his eyes wide with terror, as gunfire raged around his safe haven. Other small faces appeared at adjacent windows. Sarah, Michael, little Anna with her blonde curls. All of them looking to Sister Margaret for guidance and protection that she couldn't provide while bound and trapped in the middle of a gunfight. Something twisted in Blackjack's chest at the sight of those innocent faces. They reminded him painfully of himself at that age. Vulnerable, afraid, dependent on adults who might or might not be there when they were needed most. "Cut my hands free," Sister Margaret said urgently, twisting to show him the ropes around her wrists. "I need to get to them." "Are you insane?" Blackjack snapped, reloading his pistol with practiced efficiency. "There's a war going on out there." "Those children are my responsibility," she shot back, her brown eyes blazing with determination. "I won't leave them to face this alone." Another volley of shots rang out, and Blackjack saw Sheriff Williams advancing steadily toward their position, using overturned carts and storefronts for cover. The man was a decent shot and a better tactician. This impromptu fortress wouldn't hold for much longer. "Boss!" Scarface Pete called from across the square. "Horses are this way. We can make the canyon if we move now." It was the smart play, the safe play. Leave the woman and run for the hills, regroup with the rest of the gang and plan their next move. Blackjack had abandoned people before, when necessity demanded it. It was how he had survived this long in a world that showed no mercy to the weak or sentimental. But as he looked at Sister Margaret's face, tight with worry for her students, and then at the children's terrified faces in the schoolhouse windows, he found himself hesitating. Her words echoed in his mind. "You are still loved, Jackie. You always will be." "Cut the ropes," he said suddenly, pulling out his knife. Sister Margaret's eyes widened in surprise. "What?" "The ropes," he repeated, sawing through the hemp bindings with quick, efficient strokes. "You're right about the kids. They shouldn't have to see this." Her hands came free with a sudden snap, and she immediately began working to remove the noose from around her neck. "Thank you," she breathed. "Don't thank me yet," Blackjack said grimly, checking his ammunition. "We still have to get across that square alive." Sister Williams had reached the edge of the platform now, and Blackjack could hear his boots on the wooden steps. In seconds, they would be face to face with nowhere left to run. "Sister Margaret," the sheriff called out. "Are you hurt?" "I'm fine, Tom," she called back, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "But the children are exactly where they're supposed to be," Blackjack interrupted, rising smoothly to his feet with his gun trained on the approaching lawman. "Hello, Williams. Been a while?" Sheriff Tom Williams was a man in his early 40s, weathered by years of frontier justice, but still possessing the steady nerve that made him effective in his dangerous job. He had known Sister Margaret since she first arrived in Redemption Creek 5 years ago, and he had long harbored feelings for her that went beyond mere professional concern. "Morrison," he acknowledged with a curt nod, his own weapon never wavering. "Let her go. Your quarrel is with me, not with an innocent woman." Blackjack's laugh was harsh and bitter. "Innocent? Is that what she told you? Did she mention that she used to warm my bed in Tombstone? That she killed one of my men not 2 hours ago?" Tom's eyes flicked briefly to Sister Margaret, and she saw the questions there, the hurt and confusion. She had never told him about her past with Blackjack Morrison, had hoped that chapter of her life was buried so deeply it would never surface. "Tom," she said quietly, "it's true. I was different then, but that doesn't change who I am now, or what those children mean to me." "The past is the past," Tom said firmly, though his voice carried a note of strain. "What matters is what happens next." "What happens next," Blackjack said conversationally, "is that you and your boys are going to let us walk out of here. Because if you don't, this whole thing is going to get a lot messier than it already has." "I can't do that, Morrison. You know I can't." Blackjack nodded as if he had expected that answer. "Then I guess we're all going to find out just how much Sister Margaret's redemption is worth." The two men faced each other across the narrow space of the platform, guns drawn, each waiting for the other to make the first move. Around them, the gunfire had slowed as both sides repositioned and reloaded, but the tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Sister Margaret stood between them, her heart pounding as she realized that the two men who had shaped her life in such different ways were about to try to kill each other. Tom Williams represented her present: safety, stability, a chance at a respectable life. Blackjack Morrison was her past: dangerous, passionate, and ultimately destructive. But in this moment, they were both just men with guns, and she was tired of seeing blood spilled in her name. "Stop," she said firmly, stepping forward so that she was directly between the two gun barrels. "Both of you, just stop." "Margaret, get back," Tom ordered, his voice tight with concern and growing anger. "Mary, move aside," Blackjack said at almost the same moment, his own expression unreadable. "No," she said simply. "I won't be the cause of more violence. Not today." She turned to face Blackjack directly, ignoring the gun in his hand as if it were no more dangerous than a stick. "You asked me once why I left without saying goodbye. Do you really want to know?" Something flickered in his eyes. Uncertainty, perhaps, or old pain. "Mary, because I was pregnant," she said quietly, her words carrying clearly in the sudden hush that had fallen over the square. "With your child. And I knew that if I stayed, if I told you, you would have tried to change for me. You would have convinced yourself that you could be something different, something better. But we both would have known it was a lie." Blackjack's gun hand trembled almost imperceptibly. "A baby? I lost it 3 months later," Sister Margaret continued, her voice steady despite the tears gathering in her eyes. "A fever took it, just like the fever that took your mother. And I realized that maybe it was for the best. Because what kind of life could we have given a child? Two broken people trying to pretend they weren't broken?" The admission hung in the air between them like a physical thing, heavy with years of unspoken grief and regret. Tom Williams lowered his gun slightly, shocked by this revelation of a past he had never suspected. "You should have told me," Blackjack whispered, his voice breaking. "I had a right to know." "And then what?" Sister Margaret asked gently. "You would have left the outlaw life? Settled down to raise horses and children? We both know how that would have ended, with you dead in some dusty street, and me a widow with a baby to raise alone." Blackjack's gun slowly lowered as the truth of her words sank in. She was right, of course. He had been wild then, reckless, living each day as if it might be his last, because he secretly hoped it would be. The pain of his mother's death had driven him to seek oblivion in violence, in danger, and he would have dragged anyone who loved him down with him. "I became a nun," Sister Margaret continued, "because I needed to learn how to live with loss, how to love without possession, how to serve something greater than my own pain. And in those children, I found a purpose worth living for." She gestured toward the schoolhouse, where young faces still pressed against the windows, watching the drama unfold. "They don't care about my past, Jackie. They don't care that I once danced in saloons or shared beds with outlaws. They care that I'm here now, that I choose to stay, that I love them enough to stand between them and danger." Tom Williams holstered his gun completely, understanding dawning in his eyes. "That's why you came back to face Morrison instead of running. You couldn't leave them." "I would never leave them," Sister Margaret said firmly. "Not for safety, not for love, not for anything. They are my family now, and family doesn't abandon family." The words struck Blackjack like a physical blow. Family. It was a concept he had given up on long ago, convinced that love was nothing but a weakness that would get him killed. But looking at this woman who had once shared his bed in his dreams, who had chosen duty over desire and service over safety, he began to understand something he had missed for most of his adult life. Love wasn't about possession or passion, or the desperate need to fill the emptiness inside yourself with another person. Real love was about sacrifice, about choosing someone else's well-being over your own comfort, about staying when leaving would be easier, fighting when surrender would be simpler. His mother had loved him that way. Sister Margaret loved those children that way. And once, a long time ago, she had loved him enough to walk away rather than watch him destroy himself. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, the words barely audible above the wind. "For all of it. For the man I became. For the pain I caused. For not being worthy of what you tried to give me." Sister Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but she smiled through them. You were always worthy, Jackie. You just never believed it. The standoff might have continued indefinitely, frozen in that moment of revelation and regret, but the decision was taken out of their hands by the sound of approaching horses. A new group of riders was thundering toward the town square. Not lawmen this time, but the rest of Black Jack's gang, arriving to support their leader. "Boss," called Dutch Williams, a scarred man with silver hair and dead eyes, as he reined in his horse at the edge of the square. "We heard the shooting. You need backup?" Behind him rode 5 more outlaws, each more dangerous than the last. Snake Eye Murphy, who could put a bullet through a silver dollar at 50 paces. Iron Mike Delacroix, who had once killed 3 men with his bare hands. Little Jimmy Krause, who wasn't little at all, but who enjoyed the irony of the nickname. Sheriff Williams immediately raised his weapon again, realizing that the odds had just shifted dramatically against his small posse. His men were brave but outnumbered, and most of them were farmers and shopkeepers with more courage than training. "Tom," Sister Margaret said urgently, seeing the calculation in his eyes. "Don't let this become a massacre, please." But Black Jack was already moving, stepping forward to address his gang. "Stand down," he called out, his voice carrying the authority of command. "All of you, put your guns away." Dutch Williams looked confused. "Boss? What's going on here? Why ain't you shooting these law dogs?" "Because I said stand down," Black Jack repeated, his tone brooking no argument. "There's been enough blood spilled today." The gang exchanged uncertain glances. They had never seen their leader show mercy before, never known him to hesitate when violence was an option. Snake Eye Murphy's hand drifted toward his gun, suspicion clear in his weathered features. "You gone soft on us, Jack?" he asked dangerously. "This woman got some kind of hold on you?" The question hung in the air like the smell of gunpowder, loaded with threat and challenge. In the outlaw hierarchy, showing weakness could be a death sentence, and the gang was already beginning to sense that something fundamental had changed in their leader. Black Jack met Snake Eye's gaze steadily, and when he spoke, his voice carried all the cold authority that had made him feared across 3 territories. "You questioning my judgment, Murphy?" "Maybe I am," Snake Eye replied, his hand now resting openly on his gun butt. "Maybe I'm thinking you ain't the same man who built this gang. Maybe I'm thinking it's time for new leadership." The tension ratcheted up another notch as the 2 men faced each other across the dusty square. Sister Margaret could see the violence building like a summer storm, feel the electricity in the air that preceded bloodshed. These men lived by the gun and expected to die by it, but she couldn't bear the thought of more killing in front of the children who were still watching from the schoolhouse windows. "Jackie," she said softly, her voice cutting through the deadly silence. "Remember what your mother told you. Remember who you really are." Black Jack's hand moved to his gun, but instead of drawing it, he slowly unbuckled his gun belt and let it fall to the ground. The gesture sent a shock through both gangs and lawmen alike. In the violent world of the frontier, a man without a gun was a dead man. "My mother told me I was loved," he said clearly, his words carrying to every corner of the square. "She told me that no matter what I did, no matter how far I fell, that would never change. I spent 20 years trying to prove her wrong, trying to make myself so terrible that even God would give up on me." He looked directly at Snake Eye Murphy, unflinching despite being unarmed. "But I was wrong, and if you want to lead this gang, Murphy, then you're welcome to it, because I'm done with this life. I'm done with killing and stealing and running. I'm done being the kind of man who would hang a woman for protecting children." Snake Eye's gun cleared leather with practiced speed, the barrel swinging toward Black Jack's chest. "You always were too soft, Morrison. Guess it's time someone—" The shot that rang out came not from Snake Eye's gun, but from Tom Williams' rifle. The sheriff's bullet took the would-be usurper in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his weapon flying. Before any of the other outlaws could react, Williams had levered another round into the chamber and was already aiming at the next threat. "Anyone else want to try murder in my town?" the sheriff asked conversationally. The remaining gang members looked from their wounded comrade to their disarmed leader to the determined lawmen facing them. The odds were still in their favor, but the moral certainty that had driven them was gone. Without Blackjack's ruthless leadership, they were just a collection of violent men with no clear purpose. Dutch Williams shook his head slowly. "This ain't right, Jack. This ain't who we are." "No," Blackjack agreed. "This is who I was. But it's not who I want to be anymore." One by one, the outlaws began to back away, unwilling to fight for a leader who no longer wanted to lead them. Dutch was the last to leave, his face filled with confusion and disappointment. "You're making a mistake, Jack," he called out as he spurred his horse toward the edge of town. "You can't change what you are. None of us can." "Maybe not," Blackjack replied, "but I have to try." As the gang dispersed, Sheriff Williams kept his rifle trained on the various threats until they were all out of range. Only then did he lower his weapon and turn his attention back to the man who had terrorized his territory for so many years. "So what now, Morrison?" he asked. "You surrender peaceful-like, or do we have to do this the hard way?" Blackjack looked at Sister Margaret, then at the schoolhouse where the children's faces were still pressed against the glass, then back at the sheriff. "I'll come quietly," he said, "but I want to see the children first, to apologize." Tom Williams looked skeptical. "That's not exactly standard procedure." "Please, Tom," Sister Margaret interjected, "let him try to make this right." The sheriff studied her face for a long moment, seeing something there that convinced him. "5 minutes," he said finally, "and I'll be watching every move you make." The schoolhouse seemed smaller when Blackjack entered it, as if the presence of genuine innocence made the space contract around his corruption. The 12 children had retreated to the far corner of the room, clustering around Sister Margaret's desk like chicks seeking the protection of their mother hen. Little Timothy, the boy whose life Sister Margaret had saved, peered out from behind Sarah's skirt with wide, curious eyes. Despite everything he had witnessed, there was no hatred in his gaze, only the natural wariness of a child confronted with something he didn't understand. Blackjack stood awkwardly in the doorway, his hat in his hands, suddenly uncertain how to proceed. He had never been comfortable around children, perhaps because they reminded him too much of his own lost innocence. Their capacity for trust and forgiveness was foreign to him, threatening in a way that guns and violence were not. "Children," Sister Margaret said gently, her voice calm and reassuring despite the morning's trauma. "This is Mr. Morrison. He wants to say something to you." Blackjack cleared his throat, feeling more nervous than he had facing down armed lawmen. I want to apologize," he began haltingly, "for scaring you, for bringing violence into your safe place, for ... He struggled to find words that would make sense to young minds. "For being the kind of man who would hurt people you care about." 9-year-old Sarah stepped forward, her dark braids swaying as she tilted her head to study him. "Are you a bad man?" she asked with the directness that only children possessed. The question hit Blackjack like a physical blow. How could he explain the complexities of choice and circumstance, and the slow corruption of a soul to a 9-year-old girl? How could he tell her that he wasn't sure anymore what the difference was between being bad and doing bad things? "I've done bad things," he said carefully, "hurt people who didn't deserve it, taken things that weren't mine, made choices that caused pain." He paused, looking into her serious brown eyes. "But Sister Margaret taught me something today. She taught me that what we've done doesn't have to be what we keep doing." Timothy crept forward, no longer hiding behind his sister. "Sister Margaret says everyone can change if they really want to," he said in his small, clear voice. "She says God forgives everybody who's really sorry." "Even bad men like me?" Blackjack asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Especially bad men like you," Timothy replied with the absolute certainty of childhood faith. "Because if you're really bad, then changing is extra hard, so God is extra proud when you do it." Blackjack felt something break open in his chest, not painfully, but like ice melting in spring sunshine. When was the last time someone had looked at him with anything other than fear or calculation? When had anyone believed in his capacity for goodness? "I have something for you," he said suddenly, reaching into his vest pocket. Several hands moved toward weapons, Sheriff Williams in the doorway, his deputies flanking him. But Blackjack moved slowly, carefully, pulling out not a gun, but a small wooden carving. It was a horse no bigger than his palm, carved with surprising skill and attention to detail. The wood was smooth from handling, darkened by the oils from his hands over many years of carrying it. "My mother made this for me," he said, holding it out to Timothy. "When I was about your age, she said horses were symbols of freedom, of being able to run when you needed to and come home when you wanted to." Timothy's eyes went wide as he reached out to accept the gift. "For me? Really? Really," Blackjack confirmed. "But you have to promise me something. You have to promise that you'll always remember that you have choices, that you don't have to become what other people expect you to become, that you can choose to be kind instead of cruel, brave instead of scared." "I promise," Timothy said solemnly, clutching the carved horse to his chest. Blackjack looked around at all the children's faces, seeing something in their expressions that he had thought was lost to him forever. Acceptance. Not forgiveness, exactly, because they were too young to fully understand what there was to forgive, but acceptance of the possibility that people could change, could be more than the worst things they had done. "Sister Margaret," he said, turning to face the woman who had seen past his armor to the broken child beneath, "I want you to know that killing your man, Mad Dog Miller, it was justice. He would have murdered that boy without a second thought and probably felt good about it. You did what needed doing." She nodded, tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. "I know, but that doesn't make it easier to live with." "No," Blackjack agreed. "It doesn't. But sometimes the right choice is also the hard choice. Sometimes love requires us to do things that scar us." He paused, looking at the children who were watching this exchange with fascination. "You saved their innocence by sacrificing a piece of your own. That's what real love looks like." Sheriff Williams stepped forward from the doorway. "Time's up, Morrison." Blackjack nodded, settling his hat back on his head. But before he could move toward the door, little Sarah spoke up again. "Will we see you again?" she asked. Blackjack glanced at Sheriff Williams, then back at the girl. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I'll probably be in jail for a long time, paying for the bad things I've done. But maybe Sister Margaret will bring you to visit sometime, if she thinks it's safe." "I'd like that," Sarah said simply. As Blackjack walked toward the door, Timothy called out behind him, "Mr. Morrison, thank you for the horse, and I'll pray for you. Every night before bed." Blackjack stopped, his hand on the doorframe. When he turned back, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Thank you, son. That means more than you know." The jail cell in Redemption Creek was small and poorly ventilated, with a narrow cot, a wash basin, and little else. Blackjack Morrison sat on the edge of the cot, turning Timothy's wooden horse over and over in his hands, marveling at the craftsmanship his dead mother had possessed. 3 days had passed since his arrest, and in that time he had received only one visitor, Sister Margaret, who came each evening after school to sit with him and talk about everything and nothing. They spoke of his childhood, her transformation from Red Rosemary to Sister Margaret, the children and their progress with their lessons. They did not speak of the future. On this particular evening, as the sun painted the walls of his cell with golden light, Sister Margaret arrived carrying a worn leather Bible and a basket that smelled of fresh bread. "Mrs. Henderson insisted on sending this," she said, passing the basket through the bars. "She says any man who would give up his gun to protect children can't be all bad." Blackjack accepted the basket with surprise. "She's not afraid of me?" "She was," Sister Margaret admitted, settling into the wooden chair that Sheriff Williams had provided for her visits. "But then Timothy told her about the horse, and Sarah told her what you said about choices. Children have a way of seeing past the surface to the heart of things." Blackjack bit into one of Mrs. Henderson's biscuits, savoring the simple pleasure of food prepared with care rather than grabbed on the run between robberies. "What about you? Are you afraid of me?" Sister Margaret considered the question seriously. "Not anymore. I was once. Terrified, actually. Not of what you might do to me physically, but of what you represented." Which was the past, the person I used to be, the choices I'd made and couldn't unmake. She opened the Bible but didn't read from it, simply held it in her lap like an anchor. "You were a reminder that no matter how far I ran or how much good I tried to do, part of me would always be Red Rosemary. And now? Now I understand that Red Rose Mary wasn't something to be ashamed of. She was someone who did what she had to do to survive in a world that gave her very few choices. She was strong and clever and resilient, and when she finally found a better path, she had the courage to take it. Blackjack leaned forward, his hands clasped between his knees. "The marshal's coming tomorrow." Sister Margaret nodded. She had known this moment would come. Federal marshals didn't leave men like Blackjack Morrison in small-town jails for long. He would be transported to the territorial capital for trial, and from there, well, they both knew how the story was likely to end. "I want you to know," Blackjack said quietly, "that these past few days have been the most peaceful I've known since I was 6 years old. No running, no looking over my shoulder, no deciding who lives and who dies. Just quiet. Is that what you want? Peace?" "I want," Blackjack said slowly, as if the words were foreign to him, "to be someone worth saving. I want to be the man my mother thought I could become. The man you saw underneath all the anger and violence." Sister Margaret felt tears sting her eyes. "You already are that man, Jackie. You proved it when you dropped your gun, when you apologized to the children, when you chose to face justice instead of running. One good choice doesn't erase 20 years of bad ones." "No," she agreed, "but it's a beginning, and sometimes that's all God needs to work with. A beginning." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the light fade outside the small window. Eventually, Sister Margaret opened her Bible and began to read aloud, not from the fire and brimstone passages that many frontier preachers favored, but from the Psalms, those ancient songs of hope and despair and ultimate faith. "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted," she read, "and saves those who are crushed in spirit." Blackjack closed his eyes, letting the words wash over him. For the first time in decades, he felt something approaching peace. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Marshal Richard Donnelly arrived with the sunrise, accompanied by 2 deputies and a prison wagon. He was a no-nonsense man with graying hair and eyes that had seen too much, but he treated his prisoner with professional courtesy. "Morrison," he said as the shackles were fitted around Blackjack's wrists and ankles, "you're going to face a federal judge for your crimes. Do you understand the charges against you?" "I do," Blackjack replied calmly. "Any last requests before we head out?" Blackjack looked around the square, where his life had changed so dramatically. The schoolhouse stood open, and he could see the children inside, their young faces pressed against the windows. Sister Margaret stood on the steps of the church, her brown habit rustling in the morning breeze. "Just one," he said. "I'd like to say goodbye." Marshal Donnelly followed his gaze and nodded curtly. 5 minutes." Blackjack walked slowly across the square, his shackles clanking with each step. The children had come outside now, gathering around Sister Margaret like a protective hedge. Timothy stepped forward, still clutching the wooden horse. "Are they taking you away?" the boy asked. "Yes," Blackjack said honestly. "I have to go answer for the things I've done, but I want you to remember what I told you about choices. Every day you get to choose what kind of man you're going to become. Choose to be better than me." "Will you choose to be better too?" Sarah asked with her characteristic directness. Blackjack smiled, and for the first time in 20 years, it was a smile without shadows. "I'm going to try, little one. Every day I'm going to try." He turned to Sister Margaret, wishing he could embrace her but knowing the impropriety of it, the scandal it would cause. Instead, he simply said, "Thank you for seeing something in me worth saving, for reminding me who I used to be and who I could still become." "Write to me," she said simply. "Whatever happens, wherever they send you, write to me. Let me know how you're choosing to be better." Blackjack nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in his throat. Then he turned and walked back to the prison wagon, his head held high despite the chains. As the wagon rolled away from Redemption Creek, Sister Margaret gathered the children around her and led them back into the schoolhouse. They had lessons to attend to, futures to prepare for, hope to nurture in young hearts. And in a federal prison in Santa Fe, a man who had once been called Blackjack Morrison, but who was learning to remember his name was Jackie, began the long work of redemption, one choice at a time. Sister Margaret never did receive that letter she was hoping for. 6 months later, word came that Jackie Morrison had died in federal prison, not from violence or illness, but in his sleep, peacefully, like a man who had finally found rest after decades of running from himself. But his story didn't end there, because the best stories never really end. They echo through generations, changing lives in ways we can't always see. Timothy grew up to become a teacher himself, inspired by both Sister Margaret's unwavering compassion and Jackie's final lesson about the power of choice. He kept that wooden horse on his desk for his entire 40-year career, telling countless students about the outlaw who chose redemption over revenge, love over hatred, hope over despair. Sarah became a nurse, dedicating her life to healing the broken and wounded, never forgetting the morning when she watched a dangerous man choose to become something better. And Sister Margaret continued teaching for another 30 years, knowing that in 12 young hearts, the seeds of grace and forgiveness had been planted and would bloom in ways she might never know. She had learned something profound that morning too, that love isn't about perfection or purity, but about the courage to change, the strength to choose hope over despair, redemption over ruin. Sometimes the most powerful transformations happen not in grand gestures, but in quiet moments when someone sees past our worst mistakes to the person we could still become. The wooden horse that Jackie carved still sits in Redemption Creek's historical museum, a reminder that even the hardest hearts can soften, even the most lost souls can find their way home, and that 3 simple words, "You are loved," can change the world. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more tales from the Wild West that prove love is stronger than hate, hope more powerful than despair. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever witnessed someone choose redemption over revenge? Have you ever been given a second chance that changed everything? Remember, no matter what you've done or where you've been, your story isn't over yet. It's never too late to choose love over hate, forgiveness over bitterness, light over darkness. Until next time, keep riding toward the light and remember that grace can find us in the most unexpected places. Thanks for watching Wild West Stories. We'll see you on the next adventure, partner.